So, afternoon everybody, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to give this talk. I decided I was going to stand here because I thought this might be a trapdoor that when it gets to 20 minutes for Harriet, but she didn't disappear, so I will venture onto it at various places. So the organisers asked me to talk about an approach to paediatric obesity, and I've been involved with looking after children with severe obesity now almost for 20 years, with a weekly clinic for 20 years, so people have served less time in jail for other things. And they told me, well, actually I discovered when I came to do the talk a couple of days ago that I was talking on fierce conversations. So the first take-home message is don't have fierce conversations, okay? Because if you have fierce conversations with obesity, they just don't come back. And then you don't have a service and you haven't got anything to talk about. So we won't be talking about fierce conversations, but we will talk about perhaps giving you some evidence and what to think about when you see patients with obesity and how to frame the conversation. So I'm going to start with this one. So this is Peter. He's a 14-year-old boy. He's an only child. He weighs 84 kilograms. His parents are overweight. He's got a reasonable diet. He has takeaways once a week and some discretionary foods here and there through the week. He skips breakfast on most days. He plays soccer at school once a week. And he likes gaming and goes to bed at about 11 o'clock. So we've just heard about the sleep stuff. So we won't venture onto the sleep stuff. But what sort of things might people be recommending to Peter's parents that might be useful in terms of his weight? Eating breakfast, good. So I love it when it works. So eating breakfast. So let's talk about breakfast. So cross-sectionally, the omission of breakfast has been associated with higher rates of overweight and obesity. The problem is that there's a huge number of confounders in that relationship, such that actually, if you skip breakfast, you're probably less likely to have a routine through the day, and you're probably less likely to find time to exercise. You might have less of a routine about eating. So there's quite a few confounders. So actually, what's the evidence for when children come to you and say, I don't eat breakfast, for you to say, well, actually, I think it'd be really sensible for you to eat breakfast. So this is a study, it's a cross-sectional study in students aged 11 to 15, it's about 200 children, showing a relationship between the lack of breakfast and being overweight. However, there's this study, which is the effect of eating breakfast compared with skipping breakfast on ratings of appetite and intake at subsequent meals. And this showed that on the day when the subjects didn't eat breakfast, they consumed 362 less calories over the course of the day than when they did eat breakfast. This one's a good one. This is a longitudinal study of skipping breakfast and weight change in adolescents. And this was a study of over 14,000 children. I've learnt one thing this afternoon, which is I think I need to go and get glasses. The take-home message from this, and I'll read it off this slide, is that overweight children who never ate breakfast lost weight over the following year compared to overweight children who ate breakfast. Now, the difficulty was that in normal weight children who never ate breakfast, they gained weight. So you've got different populations of children. So at a population level, if you skip breakfast, you're probably more likely to be overweight for all the confounding factors. But actually, if you see an obese child in front of you in clinic and say, actually, I think you're skipping breakfast and that's not very good, you should really start having breakfast, then the evidence suggests that probably what you'll do is you'll make them 3 kilograms heavier over the course of a year. So what's the effectiveness of breakfast recommendations on weight loss? This was a randomized control trial from David Allison's group. And David Allison is in the US. He's been a true skeptic of some of the recommendations around obesity. And it's worth, for anybody that's interested in keeping up with the literature on obesity, actually logging on and just subscribing to his weekly blog, which is called Obesity and Energetics. And he basically, every week, I think, has a team that just pulls anything related to obesity evidence into a nice table, and you can just click through onto the things that you find interesting. So this showed a recommendation to eat or skip breakfast for weight loss was effective at changing self-reported breakfast eating patterns, but contrary to widely espoused views, this had no discernible effect on weight loss in free-living adults who were attempting to lose weight. And then finally, this was just a systematic review and meta-analysis. So current randomized controlled evidence doesn't support the general recommendation to eat and not skip breakfast for obesity-related anthropometric outcomes. So the first take-home message is don't just latch on to things when you hear things in clinic and think, oh, good, thank God that's given me something to talk about for the next 10 minutes, because I think everybody's guilty of that in the way in which we see patients. So let me ask, so who here in the audience has been affected by being overweight, or is currently overweight, or knows somebody in their family who is overweight, or has a friend or relative who is overweight? Who's got to keep your hand up if you've got an opinion on how that person might actually lose weight? So most of us, because most of us are touched by obesity because it's so common around us, and most of us have opinions because we're opinionated humans. And so for you over here, you might say, well, actually, my gran lost loads of weight because she started going to the gym and she did this, that, and the other. And you over here might say, well, my friend did the South Beach grapefruit diet and that was amazing and she lost loads of weight. But if you bring that into your clinical practice, you're in a really dangerous area. So people say, well, how do you know what to ask? And it's a bit traditional, but it's called a paediatric history and examination. Because I would challenge anyone to ask all of these questions and not find some things that you go, oh, actually, I reckon that might be something that we can talk about. Has it been gradual or sudden weight increase? Is the child worried about their weight? What was the perinatal history? Have they had steroids in the past for things like asthma? What about development? Has the child had developmental issues in terms of attaining milestones? What about school? Is the child actually skipping breakfast, going all day because they don't want to be bullied for being seen to eat at school, which happens a lot, and then they come home and they raid the cupboards and they eat for 8 hours? What about peers and friends? What about social history? What about family history? Parents who have had surgery themselves have their own opinions about what works and what doesn't, and in adolescence that can be really quite damaging in terms of the relationship between the child and the parent, but also the child feeling that the parents' recommendations are the only things that's going to work for them. And I won't go through the other ones, you can read them. This one's really important. So this is looking at height for mid-parental height. So for a girl, you're going to take the father's height and take off 13 centimetres and average it with the mother's height and come up with the mid-parental height. And likewise, for boys, you'll do the reverse equation. And basically, you end up with a point and then 8 centimetres either side, which gives you a range for where you expect the height to be. And so this was a child who came to see me, not Peter, I just put it on here, who relatively, I'm not sure whether this projects, but relatively had a weight up here that was quite high, and a height which you would say was normal, but actually relatively was short compared with the parents. And so my second take-home message is don't investigate every child, but when you see something unusual, you need to chuck the investigation book at them. And this child actually turned out to have adrenal tumours, which we removed her adrenals, we put her on steroid replacement, and she did well and started to grow and lost weight. I've seen one of those in 20 years, and I see 10 kids with lifestyle-related obesity. And so we wouldn't go investigating every single child for these things, and that's the second take-home message, is be really careful and choose wisely about the investigations that you ask for, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. And then, of course, in terms of examination, a comprehensive examination, particularly looking at things that you might not look at in a general paediatric examination otherwise. So teeth, the state of the teeth, looking at thyroid, those kind of things which actually might be quite useful and quite give you an indicator as to whether there's a medical problem or not. I think everybody gets access to these slides, don't they? I've agreed. So I think for people taking pictures, you should be able to get access to them. And there's a nice review that's come out, which I'll touch on. And what I've done, the work for you, is to just lay out on about 20 slides at the end. I'm not going to talk through them, so they're just there. You can look at them, and they just briefly pull out about all the main points from a 6 or 7 page comprehensive review on the evidence for pediatric obesity. And so this is the complexity of obesity, and so I think in 20 years I've never seen 2 children present with the same reasons for being obese and having the same set of psychosocial, economic, educational, lifestyle, neighbourhood reasons for having their weight issues. So if that's the complexity and we don't see it, you're not going to get the evidence you need unless you ask for a comprehensive history and do a proper examination. This is David Allison's paper in the New England, and this was Myths, Presumptions and Facts about Obesity, and it's worth looking at. So we're just going to run through these pretty quickly because I think they'll make common sense to you, but now that they're put into this setting of the fact that these are myths and presumptions, just think for a moment about whether this is something that you might have said to your patients. So small sustained changes in energy intake or expenditure will produce large long-term weight changes. Rubbish. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. So the whole kind of, well, if I just, cut down a little bit and have one biscuit less a day for a year, then I'll be lighter. It's rubbish. Setting realistic goals in obesity treatment is important because otherwise patients will become frustrated and lose less weight. Even I was taken with that one. I've gone, well, we've always set realistic goals. It doesn't mean that if you set unrealistic goals, they'll be met. It just means that if you set realistic goals, then you think that the child is going to be able to stick with those. And actually they get just as frustrated and it doesn't work. Large, rapid weight loss is associated with poorer long-term weight outcomes than is slow, gradual weight loss. Joe Perito at the University of Melbourne did a nice study in adults showing that actually if you put people on a crash diet and they lost a lot of weight in the first couple of months, they actually sustained that weight loss out to about a year as successfully as if people gradually lost weight, which is actually interesting because as adults we have a set point for weight and we do move back to where our set point is. But in children we don't believe that that set point has been attained, probably until later in puberty. Assessing the stage of change or diet readiness is important in helping patients who seek weight loss treatment. So another common sense thing that we would have said 5 years ago was probably pretty reasonable. It doesn't have any evidence. Physical education classes in their current format play an important role in preventing or reducing childhood obesity. That one doesn't work. The Early Bird study in the UK did that very nicely, showed that actually if children were more physically active at school, they were less physically active at weekends and when they were at home because they just effectively had a physical activity stat. Breastfeeding is protective against obesity. I'm sorry to say that unfortunately it's not, and it's not politically correct for me to say that. So breastfeeding is very good, and we know all the benefits of breastfeeding. And actually, even in the papers that show no evidence for breastfeeding, they still conclude by saying we should encourage breastfeeding because it's very good for people. And it is. But it doesn't actually, unfortunately, protect you against obesity. The bottom one I'm not so bothered about. In 20 years, I've never had an adolescent come and say, I'm thinking about losing weight through sexual activity, so I think we'll probably plough on through with that one. These are the presumptions. So regularly eating versus skipping breakfast is protective against obesity. I've just shown you some of the evidence of that. Early childhood is the period during which we learn exercise and eating habits that influence our weight throughout life. That's nice, isn't it? Really lovely. As paediatricians, we love that. It's like really fluffy. It's like you're going to be fine all through your life because you're having breakfast. Eating more fruits and vegetables will result in weight loss or less weight gain regardless of whether one intentionally makes any other behavioural or environmental changes. So you don't have to bother with everything else, you just got to have a piece of fruit and that will do the trick. So that clearly doesn't work. Weight cycling is associated. Weight cycling happens. We see kids and adults yo-yo, so they'll try for a bit, they'll lose weight. It takes your body about 18 months to learn a new set point for weight. So people will try for 3 months and they go, oh, well, actually, Christmas happened, and then they end up bigger and heavier and they go yo-yoing. And that does happen, but it's not associated with increased mortality. Snacking contributes to weight gain and obesity. I think that's probably a bit more contentious. There is some evidence for snacking, but not probably just to take on snacking on itself. And the built environment influences obesity. And we think it probably does, but it's probably not something that you can recommend to your families in terms of any useful advice. So why is dispelling these misconceptions so important? And I think it's because if you take a good history and you know the evidence in your back of the brain so that you can start to give some sensible recommendations based on evidence and not what worked for your friend's grandmother, then you can actually come up with some ideas about what other things might be driving obesity. And I'm just going to show you a few things from a research point of view that we've been involved with. So this was a paper showing in 1,000 children from the 1970s in Finland, followed over a mean period of 33 years, that actually if you're hospitalized in the first 5 years and receive antibiotics for a severe infection, you're much more likely to end up more overweight as an adult. And that's after you adjust for socioeconomic factors and all the other things that we could possibly adjust for. And we've shown that for some cardiovascular measures as well. So it allows you to start thinking about the other things which might be contributing to obesity, because our genetics haven't changed in 30 years. And our diet and lifestyle has changed, but every attempt that we make to change our diet and lifestyle isn't successful, so there must be other things that are affecting it. And people say it's epigenetics, but there's never really been good evidence for epigenetics, so it must be stuff that we haven't thought about. But if you don't take a proper history, don't examine a child, and you don't think about the other things that it could be, we'll never go forward. It allows new ideas on consequences. So when I started 20 years ago, there was Gerald Berenson's work from the US showing that actually children, if they were involved in a road traffic accident at the age of 8 to 10, if they were obese, they had evidence of atherosclerotic plaques. So we all said, oh God, you've got to get in so early because the damage is done. But actually, in this New England paper, which we were involved with cohorts from around 6 different countries, so this was 6,000 individuals followed over a mean period of 23 years, we were able to show that if you were overweight or obese as a child, but not overweight as an adult, you had the same risk of diabetes and heart disease risk factors as if you'd never been obese. So children do have plasticity, they do have metabolic flexibility. And it also allows new ideas about investigations. And one of my bugbears, which is really the third take-home message, is about fasting insulin levels. And this is where Harriet will go, oh God, here he goes again. So fasting insulin measurements, which is probably the majority of children I get referred, is please can you see this 13-year-old, this, that and the other, and I've measured their insulin, which is high, and I'm wondering whether they need treatment with metformin. And I'll talk to you about insulin in a second, but this was a follow-up study of 2,478 individuals followed over a mean period of nearly 40 years, looking at does insulin as a child, so this isn't an obese population, this is a normal population with obese individuals in it, albeit small because it was a Finnish population. And what we did was we looked here and we said, when they were young, if we looked at their fasting insulin levels, between those in black that had type 2 diabetes as an adult and those that with the hollow bars who didn't, was there a difference in their fasting insulin levels? And what you can see is that at the age of 3 and 6 there was, but there then wasn't anything between the age of 9 to 27, 30. And that's because puberty is associated with increases in insulin resistance, and that's physiological. And so all that we're doing is we're measuring physiological increases in insulin levels, and then we're saying, oh, but it's because you're overweight, and therefore you've got a risk of type 2 diabetes. Much better, in fact, is this one, which is looking at BMI. And actually, BMI at the age of 15 is a much better indicator of whether you're likely to get type 2 diabetes. So we don't need to do fasting insulin levels. And it also allows you to have a few ideas about what else might work. So this is a prime example, I think. The cleaners at Schiphol Airport got really fed up with keep clearing urine off the floor. And they put up all these signs saying, please urinate in the urinals in the men's toilets, and nobody did, and they kept getting hacked off. So all that they did was they just painted a little fly, and of course men being men will always aim at the fly, and the amount of urine on the floor went down dramatically. And it's kind of like nudge theory, it's like unconscious thinking. So we need to do this. We have this in our built environment, so that speed bumps, as you're heading towards the traffic lights, they get nearer and nearer. So you actually subconsciously think you're going faster because you're hearing them quicker and you slow down without thinking. And so that's some of the nudge work that Melissa Wake and Harriet and I and others are involved with at the MCRI. So it just allows you to think outside of the box a little bit. So let's get back to Peter. We've only got a couple of minutes left. So there he is. Look, Grandad died 2 years ago and he's been comfort eating at night ever since. So your recommendation about breakfast would have made him put on 3 kilos and probably not tackled the problem. So mother and father have type 2 diabetes. His fasting insulin level is 29 and the normal range is less than 6. So should we give him metformin? And of course, as I've just told you, the answer is no, because we know that puberty is associated with increases in fasting insulin levels. And the normal range that's quoted is an adult level of less than 6, but actually probably anywhere up to about 36 is normal in adolescents and up to about 18 to 20 in prepubertal children. So the best thing that we can do is probably not measure insulin because it confuses us and it's not associated, we think, with long-term outcomes in terms of diabetes risk. This was a study from the UK that came up with slightly different cut points of greater than 30 and greater than 20. And this was a consensus perspective and future directions piece from ESPE, the European Society of Paediatric Endocrinology, basically saying there are no clear criteria to define insulin resistance in children, and based on current screening criteria and methodology, there's no justification for screening insulin resistance in children. And the guideline, this one that's just been published from the US Endocrine Society in June last year, says there is no evidence for measuring fasting insulin levels. So please choose wisely. I probably don't investigate under the age of 10. I might do, and I might do a thyroid function, probably just that, if a child's height is not where it should be. In older children, once you get into puberty, yes, I'd probably do a one-off looking at a diabetes risk, perhaps with a screening HbA1c if I'm really worried, but I probably wouldn't bother otherwise. But I would do lipids and I would do liver function. And of course, I'd be checking blood pressure, and they're probably the main things that I'd be doing. Just to finish off, there's quite a few Cochrane reviews, so there is a bit of evidence. And these Cochrane reviews mainly say there isn't evidence for anything, which is interesting, but there is some stuff to be able to go to look at to identify where there isn't evidence. And so the take-home messages are base clinical management decisions on obesity on evidence and not myths or presumptions or viewpoints. Choose your investigations really wisely, and be comprehensive in your assessments and support and encourage, because fierce conversations aren't going to help. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. You haven't been here the last couple of days of the conference, have you? So all I've been thinking about in the last 5 minutes of your talk is that every afternoon we've had ice creams.
No, I've already been told I've got to have an ice cream. So I was like, oh, that's interesting.
And I was trying to figure out what your take on the ice cream would be. So
everything in moderation.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that validation. We've got 10 minutes till the ice creams, people, but we're going to get out first so that we can get first dibs. All right. Ben, I'm going to give you the microphone.
Yeah, so we're going to stick with the theme of sugar, and Manar Haban wanted to ask, does the type of breakfasts that you actually eat, sugary versus healthy, have any role in weight gain?
Yeah, there's competing evidence about the GI factors and whether that affects weight gain. Look, at the end of the day, if you're going to choose breakfast and you're going to, it's always better to have healthier choices. And there is some evidence to suggest that healthier choices and less sugar-laden stuff does help behaviour in the school environment and those kind of things. So I think the recommendations clearly would be to have a healthier breakfast whenever possible, yeah.
Has anyone got any questions that they'd like to ask within the room? I guess following on from Nikki's question before is that as an emergency physician, I constantly struggle with not, getting up and having breakfast, but then sometimes not eating till 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then trying to eat at 11 and having snacks. And have you got any tips and tricks for us in trying to manage that? Because
it's interesting. I think routine is always difficult, particularly in adults and particularly if you're shift workers and the rest. But actually, the most success that we have with families, and it probably is true as adults, is when there is a routine. And we all know that, if you're getting up and going to work every day, you've got a routine and things are fine, and then you go on holiday and you kind of eat all the time. And so it's about having a routine. And I think if you can encourage your patients to have routines and to think about just getting into a set routine, not just around eating habits, but as we've heard from Harriet about sleep habits and that kind of stuff, it's pretty beneficial. And I see a lot of kids where it's all complex, like the behaviour's difficult, the eating's difficult, the sleeping's difficult. If you can just get into a routine, you break the whole cycle.
Muesli bar in the pocket's my routine. Now, if this baby asks a question, I'm going to be ecstatic.
Sorry, she's not talking yet. She's chirping away, but yes. Hi, I'm Margot, and this is Clara.
Hi.
I'm from Queensland. I just wondered, there's a lot of interest in the gut microbiology and microbiota and probiotics and all of that sort of thing. Is there any evidence in that sort of stream at the moment?
Yeah, that's good, because I thought you were going to pull me up on the breastfeeding so I can breathe again now, so that's fine. There is some evidence for gut microbiota, and I think we're still at a discovery phase. I think, if people say to me, how come if you're hospitalised early on and antibiotics and some of the stuff around caesarean section, there is a suggestion there that we are affecting our microbiome. The problem is that we just haven't discovered that really truly yet. So I think, there's 2 areas that are of interest, really. Well, there's probably 3. There's still the genetics, which is going on at an exome level to find if we've missed stuff. I don't believe that's going to really turn up gold. There's the epigenetics, which still might, but is proving difficult. And I think the third is the microbiome, and there's certainly some evidence for it. The difficulty that we have is getting good samples, because you need poo samples to do it, on large numbers of individuals with comprehensive data to take account of all the cofactors. And if you use surrogate measures like blood metabolomic markers and stuff to try and give you an idea about your microbiome, it's not particularly useful.
Thank you.
Andrew McDonald from Campbelltown. I work in an Aboriginal health service, which has, it's got a very high rate of obesity. And I've developed an obesity management plan, like an asthma management plan, about what to do. One of which says eat breakfast, which I may modify. If you could tell, people need to have some hope when they leave your room. Can you tell me the 3 things I'm going to tell the parents that will give them something to do that's useful and guarantee they'll come back in 3 months' time?
Yep. So 10 years ago, I would have said diet and exercise, exercise once a week, make sure that you cut out on takeaway. They're all negative messages and they only work to a certain degree. So the things that I do now is to say we want to start with sleep. So sleep is a really good one to start with because, I kind of say to the families, all that I'm asking you to do, I'm not asking you to run a marathon or, cut out your takeaways for 6 months. All I'm asking you to do is to go to bed earlier and get better sleep, get the iPads and stuff out of the rooms. So I generally start with sleep. I then set a couple of realistic goals, mainly around a fun-based activity, which the kids are normally harp up and go, I'd love to do that, Mum, why can't I? And then you get the finance questions around it. But, so you get the kids' engagement with that and really just trying to plan ahead. So if you know that on a Thursday night it's chaos because you've got judo happening and karate and you can't get home and cook dinner and so you pick up a takeaway on the way home, if you know that's going to happen, plan for it at the weekend. Perhaps cook a bit of extra food that's good, put it in the freezer so you can put it straight into the oven when you get home. So you've just avoided the crisis moments. So probably sleep routine and a bit of regular physical activity and avoid crises.
Thank you.
Hi, Bobby Sang from Auckland. What do you think of the sugar tax, either for the population or for the individual?
Yep. So I have to be careful here because I have my own opinions, and I think everybody has their own opinions about sugar tax, and I think the ideas behind a sugar tax are very good. The concern that I have is that obesity is more common in certain socioeconomic groups, and I think it's very easy to have a tendency at a population level to just whip those groups with more taxes. So, you tax them more and they'll make healthier choices. So I think if we're going to do it, we need to make sure that we do it carefully, and I think the revenue that gets raised from those needs to be put back into things that make a difference and are healthier for families. There's no point in it just being another tax that goes into the government's pocket. It's got to be for demonstrable changes at the local neighbourhood that those people who are paying those taxes can actually see the benefits, so you're actually helping those communities.
What about the low GI diet?
So I don't get into any of that. So I don't get into low GI diets or high this or whatever. But, I'm seeing 70 kilogram 6-year-olds and 250 kilogram 12-year-olds. And I kind of go, if we're talking about diets, it's just representative of the fact that we haven't got a good understanding about what might work here.
All right, well, everybody, please thank Matt.